Hello, my name is Matt from Cut Content, and welcome to DM Radio. So this is a new show that the channel's doing, where I'm going to talk about some role-playing game stuff. I'm going to colloquially refer to it as Dungeons and Dragons, because that's the role-playing game that I think most people are probably the most familiar with, and it's the one I've been playing myself a lot lately. But I realized, rather than tormenting my friends with talking about all this to their faces when they're like, Matt, don't spoil things for me, I'm in the campaign you're running, I'm gonna torment all of you with it, so, thank you for that. My favorite part, or one of my many favorite parts about role-playing games, is character creation, and that would be a logical place to start, which is why it's weird that I'm not doing that. I know I should, but honestly, the thing that I've really been wanting to talk about, that I've been thinking a lot about lately, is the role of character death. And this seems like a weird place to begin, but I think it's an important thing that when you start running a campaign for people, and starting to run your first campaign is something we'll talk about in the future, but character death is one of the first things I think about when I'm starting to run a campaign, namely, where does it fit in? Now, for my money, I don't think that a DM should go out of their way to try and kill characters. I think that, if you're running Tomb of Horrors, yeah, okay, different situation. That's the whole point. But, as a general rule, I think you design the encounters you want to design, and that you think are logical, and make sure that, the players could reasonably overcome them, or at the very least, escape from them. But, even if you shouldn't be trying to actively kill players, I also feel that one thing that is all too common in the world of Dungeons and Dragons, and just DMing in general, is trying to save them. And I get the impetus for doing that. You want people's characters to survive, you want them to be happy, to have a sense of continuity. Totally makes sense. The problem is that one of the first things you have to understand as a DM is that you by far have the most to lose. Players might lose a character that they've put, a lot of time and effort into. If the campaign ends, you could lose an entire world. Something that you've built from scratch, all the NPCs that you have gotten into the heads of. And that's a hard thing to cope with. It really is. I know. I just recently lost a world that I'd worked a year and a half working on because of a total party kill. Which is part of why I've been thinking about this so much. So you have to accept that, this is going to be a painful thing for you. You're not necessarily doing the players a favor if you keep their characters alive. You might be doing it for more, not selfish reasons, but more personal reasons than you realize. Which can be problematic, because as the DM, the other thing you've got to go into running a game with a mindset of is that this is not your story. You may have a story you want to tell, and I think it's frequently better if you do, or at least a place you want to tell it in. But ultimately, it's up to the players to do whatever they want to do. And while I'm not saying that for you players out there, you should be like, you can see the DM's carefully constructed plotline. Allow me to go dick around in a tavern for 45 minutes and see if I can bang a waitress and not pay any attention to what's actually going on. Obviously you shouldn't do that. But that's just because you're being a dick, not because you don't have the ability to. As a DM, your job is to let your players have the option to do pretty much anything. And it's one thing if you want to talk to the players beforehand and be like, okay, so this is the sort of story I want to run, are we all good with this? That's fine. But as a rule, your players are going to do things that you've never thought of. The way I design encounters personally, and this isn't for everyone, but I have to be able to think of at least 3 ways, other than fighting, that players could get out of a situation, or I will not put the encounter in there. And don't get me wrong, half the time when I do this, the players get to the encounter, and the way they've done things makes it so that, they pretty much have to fight. They've sort of screwed over their other options. But there always have to be ways to get around the situation, or to get through the situation using role-playing. Unless we're going on, a dungeon crawl, which is, the whole point is go through the dungeon. But those exceptions aside, you don't want to put your players in unwinnable situations. Or at least unsurvivable situations. And part of the problem is that I think sometimes DMs have a tendency to not really know what encounters are going to be what level of difficulty, and I've certainly had this problem. But sometimes you don't have that problem. You know what encounter difficulty is going to be like, and the players go and they engage with it, and they make some mistakes. Everybody does. That's part of the, great nature of role-playing games, is the way they organically evolve. That can become problematic when players make mistakes that cost them their lives. Because players don't want to feel like they've screwed up that badly. Especially if it gets somebody else killed as well as themselves. That can be a hard pill to swallow. And you can't really blame them for that. But also, if you want a role-playing game to organically evolve the way it's supposed to, there have to be consequences for actions. Logical consequences. Think about it this way. If a player went up to a wooden house and decided to light a fire on the outside, it would be weird if the house didn't catch fire or burn down. So, that's sort of the approach you have to take to everything. It's just logic. There are certain ways things work. Now, if it's about an NPC making a decision, that's a bit of a different situation, and we'll get to that in a minute. But if basically the player says, I am going to do this, you have to let them do it. Unless it's physically impossible. I had a player one time who was playing a character who could fly. And he got stuck with a javelin in his shoulder. And he's like, I'm going to rip it out and fly back to the party, because he was doing some scouting. And I was like, okay. Anything else? He goes, no. I'm like, and I gave him probably more opportunities than I maybe should have to say something like, I'm going to dress the wound, or drinking a healing potion. And I asked him very explicitly, like, so you're just pulling it out and flying right back? And he was like, that is correct. I'm like, well, okay. So based on the amount of time it takes, we've established that there's not a lot of bleed damage, but you'll be bleeding enough that this is going to be problematic, and you'll go unconscious before you head back. And then I roll fall damage, and the dude was like 120 feet up in the air. He didn't survive. And that was an example of a player making a foolish mistake, but it's also one of the things that we talk about the most now. It's hilarious. And as soon as he realized what was going on, he was like, I should have drank a healing potion, huh? Damn it. But he was a great sport about it, and it was hilarious, and it was a good moment in this otherwise potentially disastrous situation. And that's just how, logically stuff works. Because you can say, well, obviously the guy would bandage himself if he was bleeding, but, maybe not everybody knows first aid, or maybe it's the blood loss that is making him dizzy in the first place, and he's not thinking straight. There are a lot of ways it can work out, but the fact of the matter is, if a player doesn't tell you, or rather, if a player does tell you what they're doing, and they're insisting that that is what they're doing, you can't fill in all the blanks for them. I'm all for reasonable, I assume characters take their armor off before they sleep. I don't think that we need to recount every minute of travel that goes by, or, have players do really bizarrely specific things, I don't know, if you cook a meal, I don't make the characters tell me what they make or whatever. But if it's a decision that's going to have very real consequences, like pulling a javelin out and, you're still bleeding, then we have to assume that the player is aware of what they're doing. And this guy, by the way, veteran player, it's just something that happens, I've made dumb mistakes as a player where I've been like, well, wasn't smart. I jumped down into I was back in 3.5 edition. So, it was a while back, not always the most balanced, especially with early level magic users. And I was playing a necromancer, but I had the burning hands spell, and we were fighting a bunch of insects, and so I jumped down into this pit of insects and cast burning hands. I was like, I will burn all the insects. And, it occurred to me a minute later, there are a lot of insects, and you can't really burn them all. If I had been smart, we had alcohol on us, just because, D&D parties, for whatever reason, tend to. I could have easily made a Molotov cocktail or something. That would have been a clever solution to this problem. But I was like, no, I'm going in, I'm dealing with it head on, and I died. And I should have died. That was my own dumb mistake that I made. And you have to let characters experience that, because if characters get saved from their own decisions, then their own decisions don't really mean anything to them. For example, and I think the DM who ran this campaign might watch this video, so not shitting on you, but I do want to raise this point, is there was a time when I had to go along with the party and find a magical MacGuffin. And we found it, and I thought about, like, what would I search for traps or whatever, and I was like, realistically, this character in this moment wouldn't. Not because he's just curious or whatever, because that can be both a beneficial and deeply annoying trait for a player to have, depending on how they use it. But I was like, this character sees the lure of magical power, and this character is going to take that opportunity without regard for his own safety. And so I touched this orb that was the magical MacGuffin, and blew the hell out of me. I died. But the DM saved me. Not really for any real reason that I could tell. And even though, like, I think he was well-intentioned, and the campaign ended up going perfectly well, as far as I could tell anyway, I was kind of bummed out, because I was like, well, didn't I make this mistake? Isn't that my mistake to make? Sometimes it's hard to feel like your decisions have consequences when those consequences don't really end up affecting you. And so I mentioned, the house lighting on fire. That's very simple. If you do this, then this will happen. Logic, straightforward. And I said that we would be getting to NPCs, so I think we should talk about those, because I recently had a party, like I mentioned, where they all died. TPK. And this is a session I've been running for almost a year. Or a campaign I've been running for almost a year. And they died right in the middle of this session. And not like, there were a few times during this campaign where it was a gothic horror campaign, so I expected they weren't all going to make it out, and I was very clear about that, and people embraced that. But I admit the way they ultimately died was not the way I expected them to, which is, part of what you deal with. But I did have an opportunity where I could have said the NPCs fighting them could take them prisoner rather than killing them. One of them would have died anyway, but the rest of them maybe. And ultimately, I just had to, I had to think about where the NPCs were at, where the enemies were at, what they would have been thinking after this fight. And the truth is, they wouldn't have done that. Granted, there were some mitigating factors, but ultimately, after the party did much better in this encounter than I expected them to, and they killed a lot of these enemies that I honestly wasn't expecting them to actually fight. So I was pretty impressed with how well they handled themselves. But then I was also like, if there were so many of these enemies, and almost all of them had been killed at this point, are the few that remain really gonna take the chance? And I had to think about, on the one hand, if they do, the campaign gets to keep going. And I spent a lot of time over the past year and a half working on this campaign. So it was very tempting. But I also had to acknowledge that that's not how it would read to the players. It wouldn't read as the NPCs made this decision for this, and this reasons. Even if I would have those reasons, they wouldn't have a chance to know that. It would feel like the players would all know they made a tactical error, and I chose to spare them, thus negating the consequences of their actions. And this isn't true for every game, but for the games I run, I like to really make a point of having the players be active in the world. The things they do affect the way the world shapes up. I've got one world that I run all my standard D&D fantasy campaigns in, and it's mostly shaped by players and what they do. And these players have been making a huge difference in the region that they were fighting in. Like, far more so at far earlier levels than I thought, because they were really good at what they were doing, and they were playing smart. But sort of the point of especially something like a Gothic horror campaign is that it only takes one screw-up for things to go really, really south. It's like, people always say, Lex Luthor has to win one time, Superman has to be perfect every single fight, or the world is boned. And while I hate that example just because I hate Superman and Lex Luthor, and not to get into this, we could talk about comics another time. I don't care for DC Comics as a general rule, but regardless of my personal feelings about Superman, the world's greatest Mary Sue, the point is actually a good one. The heroes have to be heroes every time. And that's really hard, but it's also part of what makes it so meaningful and impactful. And the fact that these great heroes were killed in what ultimately would have been, on a grand scale, a minor skirmish, is maybe not the most satisfying thing narratively for me as the DM or for the players, but it was also the most honest emotionally. And if you don't have emotional honesty, and if you don't have the level of integrity as a DM to take those hits, oftentimes the campaigns just wind up being lackluster. Now, there are certain exceptions. Like, for example, when I mentioned that the time I touched this magical orb and should have died, that was also the very first session of the game. So, while on the one hand, it's by far the easiest to work in a new character after that session is over, on the other hand, like, it's not like I really felt like my decisions were having a huge impact anyway, because I was a level 1 asshole wandering through this, Magic Fortress place. I didn't feel like my previous decisions were invalidated, and I totally get why the DM in that case decided that, party cohesion was more important than whether or not I personally survived. But these guys have been playing in this campaign for months at this point. Like I said, almost a year, and that just it just would have really undermined all the progress they made if they felt like there hadn't been a risk of failure the entire time. And I think that's what I really want to end on, is the idea that everything that players do is a deliberate risk, and it's a choice they make. And we as DMs have to let them do that. Because even if something seems laughably obvious to us, it might not to them. And that's just the way things are. I had a party wipe in the first session, all of them, every single one, because they were fighting what essentially amounted to zombie wolves, and they were trying to capture the wolves instead of kill them. For obvious reasons, that didn't go well. And as much as I love telling that story, I don't want to keep you longer, just for the sake of hearing my own voice, or to belabor a point. But the thing is, that changed the tone of the whole campaign, is that when their next characters arrived a few weeks later, they heard about those characters who had died, and suddenly the whole campaign was kind of darker than it was meant to be. But it worked out really well. And part of what we're supposed to do as DMs is take those punches and roll with them, so that the players can have the experience that they deserve to have. And oftentimes I find that if you don't adhere so strictly to the story that you've personally come up with, or like, at least the way I always go into a session is, I know what I would do in these situations if I were a player, so here's how I would expect it to advance, and you just know it won't work that way. If you sort of are able to set that aside, I think a lot of the times it makes for an actually better campaign. And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it ends the campaign and you take that hit. But that's the right thing to do, in most cases. Because if you do that, the players will feel like, yeah, we screwed up, but we can own that. And that means that everything we've accomplished up to that point, we earned. And I think that players' sense of really owning and deserving what they've achieved is very important to running a successful role-playing game. So, thank you all for listening to the first episode of DM Radio. There will be more in the future. I'm not sure how often I'll intersperse these with Let's Plays, but, we'll figure it out. For now, thank you for watching. and tune in for more cut content in the future. Have a good one, everybody.